The year is 1918. The world is exhausted. 4 years of the most brutal war humanity had ever seen were finally coming to an end. Soldiers in the trenches of France, Belgium, and Germany were counting the days. Families back home were waiting for letters. Cities were crowded, hospitals were overwhelmed, and people desperately wanted to believe that the worst was behind them. They had no idea what was coming. Because while the cannons were still firing, something else was already moving. Something you couldn't see, couldn't hear, and couldn't shoot. It traveled in the air, in a cough, in a breath. It passed between soldiers sharing a blanket, between strangers on a train, between a mother and her child. And by the time anyone realized how serious it was, it had already spread across the entire planet. This is the story of the Spanish flu, the deadliest pandemic in modern history, and a story that most people, even today, don't fully know. Let's go back to where it all started, and when we do, we find ourselves not in Spain, not in Europe, but in the middle of the American heartland. On March 4th, 1918, a young man named Albert Gitchell reported to the infirmary at Camp Funston, a military base in Kansas. He was a cook. He complained of a sore throat, a fever, and a bad headache. It seemed ordinary, a simple cold, maybe. The doctor noted it and sent him to rest. But within hours, dozens of other soldiers were lining up with the exact same symptoms. By the end of that day, over 100 men were sick. Within 3 weeks, more than 1,100 soldiers had been hospitalized, and thousands more had fallen ill across the base. Nobody panicked. Not yet. The flu was common. People got sick, people got better. Life went on. The army had a war to fight, and these soldiers were needed in Europe, so they were loaded onto ships and sent across the Atlantic Ocean, carrying the virus with them unknowingly into a world that had absolutely no defense against it. Now, here's something important you need to understand about this flu. It wasn't like a regular flu. A regular flu kills the very old, the very young, the already weak. That's how disease usually works. It targets the vulnerable. But this virus did something that shocked every doctor who witnessed it. This outbreak disproportionately affected young adults aged 20 to 40, rather than the elderly, who are typically more vulnerable to influenza. The strongest, healthiest people in society, soldiers in their prime, young mothers, workers in their 20s were dying at alarming rates. Scientists later figured out why. Research showed that monkeys infected with the recreated flu strain died from an overreaction of the immune system. This may explain why the Spanish flu had its surprising effect on younger, healthier people, as a person with a stronger immune system would potentially have a stronger overreaction. Wikipedia. Think about that for a moment. Your own immune system, trying to fight the virus with everything it had, could literally destroy your lungs in the process. The harder your body fought, the more damage was done. The young and the strong were betrayed by the very thing designed to protect them. By the spring of 1918, the virus had reached the battlefields of Europe, and the conditions there were perfect for a disease to explode. Hundreds of thousands of men packed into filthy trenches, malnourished, sleeping on top of each other, breathing the same air. 3/4 of French troops and more than half of British troops fell ill in the spring of 1918. PubMed Central. But this first wave, as violent as it seemed, was still relatively mild compared to what was coming. Many soldiers got sick, rested for a few days, and recovered. Military commanders breathed a sigh of relief. They thought it was passing. They were wrong. Then came the fall of 1918, and with it, the second wave. Something had changed in the virus. It had mutated, and the version that came back in August and September of 1918 was a different beast entirely. It was faster, more brutal, and deadlier than anything the world had seen in living memory. No matter what people called it, the virus attacked everyone similarly. It started like any other influenza case, a sore throat, chills, fever. Then came the deadly twist. The virus ravaged its victims' lungs. PAHO. One doctor, Writing to a colleague in September 1918, described what he was seeing in language that was raw and desperate. He wrote that patients with what seemed like ordinary flu would rapidly develop what he called the most vicious type of pneumonia he had ever seen. And then, as the oxygen left their bodies, their skin would turn blue, a condition called cyanosis. He wrote that at that point, it was simply a struggle for air until they suffocate. People were struck with illness on the street and died rapid deaths. One account tells of 4 women playing bridge together late into the night, and by morning, 3 of them were dead from influenza. Others told stories of people on their way to work who suddenly developed the flu and died within hours. Stanford. Not days, hours. Cities were the first to be overwhelmed. Philadelphia became one of the hardest-hit places in the entire world. On September 28, 1918, city officials decided to go ahead with a large Liberty Loan Parade, a patriotic march to raise money for the war effort. Nearly 200,000 people lined the streets, shoulder to shoulder, cheering and celebrating. Health officials had warned against it. They were ignored. Within 72 hours of that parade, every single bed in Philadelphia's 31 hospitals was full. Within a week, the city was in crisis. Doctors and nurses were collapsing from exhaustion. Morgues ran out of space. Bodies were being stacked in hallways. There weren't enough coffins. There weren't enough grave diggers. Survivors interviewed decades later still couldn't find the right words for it. One man described bodies being loaded onto horse-drawn wagons and carried through the streets, while neighbors watched from behind closed curtains, too afraid to go outside. A woman remembered the silence. The streets that were normally full of noise and life had gone completely quiet. No children playing, no vendors calling out, just silence, broken occasionally by the sound of another wagon moving slowly down the street. As one survivor put it, it wasn't just one family that was affected, it was entire communities. Alabama Department of Public Health. Across the country, the story was the same. In Kentucky, a coal miner named Temus Bartley was 95 years old when he was interviewed about what he had seen. He remembered it clearly. The mines shut down for 6 weeks in 1918. Men went from digging coal to digging graves. Christopher Newport University. There wasn't enough labor to do both. In Montana, a woman named Loretta Gerusi recalled how people would pass through her tiny town, seemingly perfectly healthy, and then be reported dead just 2 days later. Her own father fell gravely ill and came within a hair's breadth of dying. She believed his life was saved only because the son of the local doctor happened to be an army doctor who recognized the flu symptoms that others had missed. Christopher Newport University. One correct diagnosis, one moment of luck, that was the difference between life and death. In rural Alabama, a woman named Mrs. Boone, who was 100 years old when she told the story, recalled that her family was the only one in their area who didn't get sick. And instead of staying behind closed doors counting their blessings, her parents became instant nurses. She spent her days delivering soup to the homes of ill families, walking from house to house in a community where almost everyone was bedridden. Alabama Department of Public Health. Think about the courage in that. A young girl carrying soup through a neighborhood dying of a disease no one understood. The hospitals were a different kind of horror. Nurses were the unsung heroes of this entire catastrophe. The nursing shortage was so severe in parts of the United States that the Red Cross had to ask local businesses to allow their workers time off during the day so they could volunteer in hospitals at night. Stanford. Women who had never stepped foot in a medical ward were suddenly changing sheets soaked in blood, holding the hands of strangers taking their last breaths, and walking home alone in the dark to do it all over again the next morning. One nurse walked into a home and found a husband dead in one room while his wife lay in another,
having just given birth to twins. It had been 24 hours since the death and the births. The wife had had nothing to eat except an apple that happened to be within arm's reach. Paho. There are no words for that. Not really. And what about the people in power? What did the governments of the world do? Not enough. Not nearly enough. In order to avoid alarming the public, several local health authorities refused to reveal the number of people affected or the death toll. PubMed Central. Wartime censorship meant that newspapers in many countries were forbidden from reporting on the scale of the disaster. Editors were pressured. Articles were killed. The public was kept in the dark at precisely the moment they needed information to protect themselves. That's why the disease became known as the Spanish flu. Spain was a neutral country during World War I. Its press wasn't bound by the same wartime censorship. So when the King of Spain and millions of Spanish citizens fell ill, the Spanish newspapers reported it freely. Because Spain's press, unshackled by the wartime restrictions laid on media in other countries, robustly covered the pandemic's deadly impact, the rest of the world assumed Spain was the origin. Smithsonian Magazine. It wasn't, but the name stuck, and an entire country was blamed for a disaster it didn't cause.
Even the most powerful people in the world were not safe. Franklin D. Roosevelt, then serving as Assistant Secretary of the Navy, was stricken with flu while crossing the Atlantic on the USS Leviathan. Several people on board died during the voyage. When the ship docked in the United States, Roosevelt was so weak he could not walk unaided and had to be carried off the ship on a stretcher. Smithsonian Magazine. President Woodrow Wilson himself fell ill with the flu in early 1919 while he was in Paris negotiating the Treaty of Versailles, the agreement that would officially end World War I. Stanford. Some historians believe his illness directly affected his ability to negotiate effectively, and that the harsh terms imposed on Germany in the final treaty, terms that many experts believe contributed to the rise of Adolf Hitler and the Second World War, were partly a consequence of a president whose mind and body had been ravaged by a flu virus. That's a staggering thought. A microscopic organism, invisible to the naked eye, may have helped shape the political catastrophe that would define the next 30 years of human history. The virus didn't spare artists either. The Norwegian painter Edvard Munch, the man who created The Scream, perhaps the most famous painting of human anguish ever made, contracted the Spanish flu. He captured his own agony in a painting called Self-Portrait with the Spanish Flu. In it, his face is pale and hollow, his body wrapped heavily in a dressing gown, his expression conveying the torturous state of his condition. Smithsonian Magazine. He survived, thankfully, but the painting is a window into what millions felt and never had the chance to record. The American writer Catherine Ann Porter was also struck down while working as a journalist in Denver. Already suffering from bronchitis, she was first misdiagnosed and nearly died. She later transformed the experience into a short novel called Pale Horse, Pale Rider, published in 1938, Smithsonian Magazine. It remains one of the most intimate literary accounts of what it felt like to be consumed by the flu, the fever, the hallucinations, the strange floating sensation of being between life and death, and the devastating grief of waking up to find that someone you loved had not survived while you did. By the time the third wave finally faded in the spring of 1919, the numbers were almost impossible to comprehend. The influenza pandemic of 1918 and 1919 killed more people than the Great War itself, somewhere between 20 and 40 million people. It has been cited as the most devastating epidemic in recorded world history. More people died of influenza in a single year than in 4 years of the Black Death bubonic plague from 1347 to 1351. Stanford.
The pandemic infected approximately 1/3 of the entire global population, roughly 2 billion people at the time. EBSCO. In the United States alone, 1 in 4 Americans got sick. More than 500,000 died. And those numbers, enormous as they are almost certainly undercounts, because in many parts of the world, in Africa, in South Asia, in remote rural communities, people died in their homes with no doctor, no record, no count. Modern estimates put the true global death toll somewhere between 50 and 100 million people. Some researchers believe it could have been higher. So why don't we talk about it more? That's a question historians have been wrestling with for decades. The First World War is remembered. The Second World War is remembered. The Black Death is in every history book. But the Spanish flu, which killed more people than all of those events, barely gets a chapter. Part of the answer is that it happened at the same time as the war. The war was dramatic, visible, political. It had heroes and villains, battles and treaties. The flu was invisible. It didn't have a face. You couldn't blame a general or a government. You couldn't march against a virus. People survived it and then somehow tried to forget it, because remembering it meant sitting with a kind of helplessness that was almost too heavy to bear. Although individual survivors vividly recalled how the event affected them, the plague seems to have had little lasting impact on the collective psyche. Mention of the pandemic by historians and writers of the period was generally casual, brief, or non-existent. EBSCO. The world had been through so much, people were ready to move forward, and so they buried the flu along with their dead, and they tried to get on with living. But the flu left marks that couldn't be erased. Orphaned children who never knew their parents, communities that shrank and never fully recovered, young men who survived the trenches only to die in a hospital bed back home, women who gave birth in rooms where their husbands had just drawn their last breath. And somewhere in a small house in Arkansas, a man remembered taking the ceiling boards out of his own home to build coffins for his neighbors because there was nothing else to use. That detail, pulled from a recorded oral history decades later, is the kind of thing that stays with you. Not the statistics, not the political analysis. That image, a man pulling apart his own ceiling to give his neighbors a dignified burial.
Here is what the Spanish flu teaches us. Even now, more than 100 years later, it teaches us that the world can be rearranged overnight, that something invisible can be more powerful than any army, that governments will always be tempted to hide bad news until they can't anymore, that the people who hold communities together during catastrophe are almost never the ones in charge. They're the nurses walking home in the dark, the neighbors delivering soup, the local doctors who recognize something the others missed. And it teaches us something about memory itself, about what we choose to remember and what we choose to forget, about how the most devastating events in history can be pushed aside because the grief is too large, the helplessness too raw, the desire to move on too strong. The Spanish flu ended. The world rebuilt itself. People fell in love again, had children again, laughed again. Life has this extraordinary stubbornness, this refusal to stop. And that, maybe, is the other side of this story. Not just the dying, but the surviving. Not just the grief, but the soup delivered to the sick neighbor. Not just the ceiling boards taken for coffins, but the hands that built them. An invisible virus moved through the world in 1918 and killed millions of people. And millions more got up, brushed themselves off, and kept going. That's not nothing. In fact, that might be everything. History only survives if people choose to remember it. So hit that like button, share this video, and help keep this story alive, because the people who lived through 1918 deserve to be remembered. See you in the next one.